There was a time when South Africa was not just a country, it was a symbol of resistance, a symbol of black dignity, a symbol of victory over white supremacy. For millions of Africans across the continent, South Africa was proof that black people could defeat one of the most brutal systems in human history and still emerge with forgiveness instead of vengeance. During apartheid, African nations sacrificed for South Africa. Nigeria nationalized British petroleum over support for apartheid. Frontline states sheltered the ANC fighters, and African countries funded liberation movements while their own economies struggled. South Africa was not liberated alone. Africa stood behind it. On Freedom Day this year, the President of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa himself, acknowledged this debt, telling the nation that South Africa did not walk alone into freedom. It was carried by a tide of solidarity from across the continent, which is why the scenes unfolding right now in the middle of 2026 feel so painful to so many Africans. Because today, the children of Africa are turning against one another. Again, and this time, it is happening faster, louder, and more publicly than ever before. For nearly 2 decades now, South Africa has experienced repeated waves of violence against African migrants. Nigerians, Mozambicans, Zimbabweans, Somalians, Ethiopians, Ghanaians, Malawians, and the Congolese. Many are attacked not because they are criminals, but because they are foreigners. Some scholars and activists reject the word xenophobia. They call it Afrophobia because the hostility is overwhelmingly directed at black Africans from the north of the Limpopo River, while white immigrants and wealthy foreign investors rarely face the same suspicion. In 2008, more than 60 people were killed during the first major wave of xenophobic violence, and shockingly, a third of the dead were South Africans themselves, attacked for looking foreign or speaking the wrong language. It happened again in 2015 and again in 2019 when Nigerian-owned businesses were singled out. Again in 2021 and even 2022 with the rise of Operation Dudula. And in 2026, it has returned with frightening speed and scale. By mid-May, at least 7 people had been killed since protests began in March. Then, in late May, French violence broke out in the coastal town of Mossel Bay, leaving more people dead and hundreds of foreign nationals displaced. Mozambique's government said 5 of its citizens had been killed there. South African police confirmed 2 of those deaths and continue investigating the rest. By June, anti-immigrant groups had set a hard deadline. All undocumented migrants were to leave South Africa by June 30th, 2026, or face consequences the groups themselves promised to enforce. To understand this crisis, you must first understand the frustration inside South Africa itself. South Africa remains one of the most unequal countries on earth. Millions remain trapped in poverty more than 30 years after apartheid ended. Youth unemployment is catastrophic. The country's broader unemployment rate has been measured at over 43% by some counts, and in others it has been placed above 30%, among the highest in the world. Crime is rampant, infrastructure is failing, electricity blackouts have become normal, Corruption scandals continue, including inside the very department responsible for managing immigration. Many black South Africans feel betrayed. They were promised economic freedom after apartheid. Instead, many still live in townships, while a small elite, both black and white, control immense wealth. A survey by the Inclusive Society Institute found that distrust of African immigrants among South Africans climbed sharply in just a few years, from roughly 63% in 2021 to over 73% by 2025. And in times of suffering, people look for someone to blame. This is where migrants enter the story. A growing number of South Africans believe foreign Africans are taking jobs, running criminal networks, overcrowding hospitals, and dominating informal businesses. Two movements now drive this anger more than any others. The first is Operation Dudula, a Zulu word which means force out. It emerged in 2021 and has repeatedly blocked migrants from entering clinics and schools without South African identity documents. In one case in mid-2025, a one-year-old Malawian boy reportedly died after the group prevented his family from accessing two clinics in Alexandra Township because they lacked a South African ID. A court later ruled the group's healthcare blockades unlawful. The second group is called March and March. It was founded in 2025 by former radio presenter Jacinta Ngubese Zuma. She rose to national prominence after organizing protests outside the Durban primary school, claiming local children were losing school placements to the children of undocumented migrants. The movement has since spread from KwaZulu-Natal into Gauteng, the Western Cape and beyond. And it was March and March that set the June 30th deadline. These are not fringe movements anymore. Political parties including Action XA and Patriotic Alliance, the Inkatha Freedom Party, and the Umkhonto we Sizwe have appeared at or openly engaged with their demonstrations. Their supporters argue, in essence, South Africans are suffering while foreigners prosper, and too many unemployed citizens. That message resonates emotionally, but economists and migration researchers repeatedly argue that migrants are being scapegoated for much deeper structural problems and that the data on migrant crime and job displacement is far weaker than the rhetoric suggests. Because the real crisis did not begin with Nigerian shopkeepers or Zimbabwean workers. It began long before that. It began with inequality, failed governance, corruption, and an economy that never fully transformed after apartheid. President Ramaphosa himself has repeatedly warned South Africans not to scapegoat migrants for economic problems that predate the current wave of migration entirely. But anger is easier to direct at visible outsiders than at complicated systems. It is also worth noting South Africa's 2026 local government elections are scheduled for later this year, between November 2026 and January 2027. Several political analysts have openly questioned whether parties are amplifying anti-migrant sentiments to harvest votes from a frustrated electorate, turning what should be a policy debate into an election strategy. Social media has intensified the crisis. On Twitter, hashtags blaming foreigners for crime and unemployment trend regularly. On Facebook and TikTok, viral videos spread claims about immigrants taking over communities. Some videos are real, others are exaggerated. Many, according to the South African government official, are outright fabrications, manipulated footage and misleading crime reports designed to inflame public anger and spread faster than any fact check can catch up to them. Online outrage becomes street anger, and street anger becomes violence. Across Africa, reactions are equally emotional. Many Africans now openly say they feel betrayed by South Africa. On Nigeria, Ghanaian, and Malawian social media especially, anger has grown intense as images circulate of citizens being bussed out of Durban or boarding repatriation flights home. Some Africans ask, how can the same country Africa fought to free now reject Africans? Others accuse South Africans of forgetting history, and this emotional divide is beginning to damage Pan-African unity itself. What makes 2026 different from previous waves is not just the violence, it is the speed at which it has spilled across borders. By early June, more than 3,000 Malawians, including hundreds of children, were sheltering in an open field in Durban that had transformed overnight into a makeshift transit camp. They were waiting for buses home. Nigeria began flying its citizens out of Johannesburg. A first group of 260 people landed in Lagos in mid-June. The country's foreign ministry said roughly 1,000 more Nigerians had asked to be evacuated. Ghana, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi launched similar repatriation programs within the same week. More than 150 Malawians were bussed out of the Western Cape in a single weekend, and about 150 additional migrants from Burundi, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe took shelter at a government office near the Durban camp, with nowhere else to turn. Even in Ekurhuleni's industrial heartland, Boksburg, Springs, Benoni, marchers moved from factory to factory in early June demanding that businesses fire every foreign worker, documented or not, before the 30th of June. Some companies simply closed their gates rather than respond. Kenya, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Ghana issued formal travel warnings to their citizens living in South Africa. Nigeria summoned South Africa's acting high commissioner to demand an explanation. This is no longer a domestic story, it is a continental one. On the 7th of June 2026, President Cyril Ramaphosa addressed the nation from the Union Building in Pretoria. It was by the presidency's own transcript the first time a sitting South African president had used the word Afrophobia in a national address, stating plainly that there is no place in South Africa for xenophobia, racism, sexism, Afrophobia, or any other form of intolerance. He announced a new comprehensive approach to migration management, dedicated immigration courts, thousands of new labor inspectors, upgraded biometric identity systems, and tougher penalties for employers hiring undocumented workers. He also admitted something rarer for a head of state, that corruption and weak enforcement inside his own government's Department of Home Affairs had helped create the condition for the crisis. He insisted that enforcing immigration law is the job of the state alone, not the private citizens, a direct rebuke to the vigilante groups checking the IDs in the streets. Human rights organizations, including the International Commissions of Jurists and Lawyers for Human Rights, welcomed the speech, but pointed out something. Ramaphosa never named March and March or Operation Dudula directly, even as their June 30th deadline pushed 6 African governments into emergency evacuation mode. The anti-migrant group noticed the omission too, and within a day of the speech, March and March marched through Ekurhuleni's factory anyway, rejecting the president's reform outright and reaffirming their deadline. Not every South African politician has stayed silent on the racial undertone of the movement. At an EFF rally on Workers' Day, party leaders Julius Malema addressed the anti-migrant violence directly, suggesting its targets reveal an underlying fear of confronting white economic power rather than black migrants. Former President Thabo Mbeki, speaking separately at an African Day lecture in May, warned that telling an African migrant in Johannesburg to go home misunderstands history because, in the mind of many across the continent, the struggle against apartheid was never just a South African struggle, it was an African one. The diplomatic fallout has been swift. Ghana formally petitioned the African Union requesting a debate at the African Union's Media Coordination Summit in Cairo, specifically on xenophobic attacks against African nationals in South Africa. Ghana's foreign minister said the country was compiling a list of the Ghanaian assets lost in the unrest for possible future legal action. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres expressed concern over the reported attacks. The African Commission on the Human and People Rights called on Pretoria to investigate the violence and guarantee migrants access to justice. South African government has tried to walk a careful diplomatic line, condemning the violence while resisting the word xenophobic applied to the nation as a whole. Speaking during a visit by the Kenyan President William Ruto, Ramaphosa argued the crisis is a continental migration challenge requiring African-led solution and deeper economic integration, not a uniquely South African failure. Ruto in turn suggested the deeper issue is uneven development, that people move towards South Africa precisely because opportunity is so unevenly distributed across the continent. South Africa's Justice Minister has warned that the unrest is already damaging the country's cultural and economic footprint abroad, with South African musicians reportedly having performances cancelled in other African countries in apparent retaliation. Whether the Cairo summit produces anything beyond statements of concern remains to be seen. There is another question now circulating across Africa. Is the chaos in some way politically useful? Researchers who study South Africa's anti-migrant movement argue that today's campaign follows a familiar playbook. Real grievances about crime, unemployment, failing services are channeled into a simple emotional satisfying message. Migrants are the problem. It's not a hidden conspiracy, it is something more visible, political opportunism in plain sight ahead of a real election. With local government elections looming between November 2026 and January 2027, multiple political analysts have publicly questioned whether parties are amplifying anti-migrant sentiment to convert frustration into votes. One academic at the University of KwaZulu-Natal described migration as being used as a political fodder to secure support, shaped more by election timing than by genuine policy debate. Think about it. When citizens are angry over unemployment, the anger can move upward towards political and economic elites who have failed to deliver, or sideways towards vulnerable foreigners who have no political power to push back. History shows that governments and movements under pressure often find it easier to manufacture an internal enemy than to admit the failure of policy. To be clear, there's no confirmed evidence of a single coordinated plot. That distinction matters, and the people who lead this movement present themselves as grassroots civic organizations responding to genuine community pain. And for many ordinary supporters, that pain is real. But history also teaches something else. Division has long been one of the most effective tools available to anyone who benefits from a population looking sideways instead of upward. Perhaps the saddest part of this story is that it is happening among people who share the same historical wounds. Colonialism divided Africa. Apartheid humiliated black humanity. The slave trade scattered African blood across oceans, and yet today, Africans insult each other over borders drawn by colonial rulers who never asked permission. A Nigerian shopkeeper is called a criminal. A Zimbabwean worker is called an invader. A Malawian family is called a burden. Meanwhile, poverty remains, inequality remains, corruption remains. The enemy changes, but the suffering stays exactly where it was. South Africa stands at a crossroads again. It can choose fear or solidarity. It can choose scapegoats or solutions because once hatred becomes normalized, it rarely stops where it began. The Justice Minister herself warned that failing to address this could fracture the country along tribal lines, not just against foreigners, but among South Africans themselves, some of whom have already been targeted simply for how they look or sound. Today, it is migrants. Tomorrow, it could become ethnic groups, political opponents, or even fellow citizens accused of not belonging enough. And the irony would be devastating. The nation that defeated apartheid, building new forms of exclusion against fellow Africans, using the language of community protection to dress up as an old, ugly instinct. Mandela warned the world about oppression, but perhaps the greatest tragedy is when the oppressed begin oppressing another. Nelson Mandela once declared, "Never, never, never again." But today, as repatriation flights leave Johannesburg and a deadline looms on June 30th, many Africans are asking, has South Africa forgotten? Or is Africa itself forgetting what unity was supposed to mean?
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.